ecosystem, conservation biology can be studied at these levels as well. What a conservation biologist typically does is they come in and they determine the minimum viable population size. Think about what that word means. Minimum viable population size. The minimum number of organisms that must be in that population for it to survive. They go in and they decide, do we need to increase the number of organisms? Is this organism at risk at its current number? And when they study the populations, they look at sometimes metapopulations, sometimes subpopulations. They really study it in many different ways. So, for example, when I'm studying those Siberian tigers, I may go in and I may look at all the tigers in India. That would be the metapopulation, the large population of tigers. Or I may look at a subpopulation of tigers. I may look at just the tigers just living in one small forest. So you can look at these populations in different ways. The governments in different countries, the United States, around the world, have really stepped in to require conservation biology to be going on. In the United States, the big push for conservation biology was really started by the Endangered Species Act in 1973. The Endangered Species Act, let's write this down, it prohibits any action that would destroy endangered species habitats. It prohibits any action that would destroy the habitats of endangered species. It prohibits any action that destroys the habitats of endangered species. It also prohibits the trade in any products made from endangered species, such as ivory or leathers or furs. So we are prohibiting action that would destroy the habitats of these endangered species and prohibiting the trade of any products made from, produced from these endangered species. There have been some controversy with this act. Some people have argued that the act puts the protection of the endangered species in front of the protection of the livelihood of people. That it's putting more emphasis on helping these organisms survive than helping people make a living and get a profit from their land. So there are some exceptions to the Endangered Species Act. Those are called habitat conservation plans and safe harbor agreements. These are some exceptions to the Endangered Species Act. They're things where landowners, company owners, individuals can go and work with the government to still be able to use land where endangered species live, or to still be able to work on land where endangered species live. It doesn't give them the right to go in and kill endangered species, but it does give them the right to still provide for themselves, have their livelihood, while working to conserve the endangered species. As of 2010, the last time a survey was done, about 1,000 species were endangered in the U.S., 1,010. 314 were threatened, but of those threatened and endangered species, 90% had recovery plans in place that were working them towards becoming non-threatened and non-endangered. This work obviously doesn't just happen in the United States. Internationally, it happens as well. You can see from the dates that it was happening in the United States around the same time it was happening in the rest of the world. First major event on the world scale was this Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. It was 1973. This was driven by the United Nations, and it still continues today. In 1992, there was a convention with the countries around the world on biological diversity. Just like with pretty much every major international treaty or symposium, the United States goes, they work, but they never really agree to the final conclusions. Your book has a list of all of the outcomes of this Convention on Biological Diversity, and if you go and look at it in the book, it very closely links up to all of the goals that we have in our own Endangered Species Act. So governments have really stepped in to set up regulations. Let's finish up this chapter by talking about some of the methods for recovery and protection that have come into place from these regulations and from these laws. Captive breeding is something that happens in zoos. You know, we have organisms or species in a zoo or in some kind of sanctuary. We breed them in captivity. And this is what has really been successful for many species from bringing them back from close to extinction. The probably most famous example of success with captive breeding are those condors. We wrote an essay about them earlier in the year. And then, if captive breeding is successful, a lot of times what is done is reintroduction. So, taking the organisms and putting them back into their wild habitats. This has been successful, an example of reintroduction with gray wolves in Yellowstone. Gray wolves were hunted to the point of almost complete extinction extirpation in Yellowstone National Park, but we were able to breed them in captivity and then reintroduce them. Something that's kind of an idea more for the future is cloning. There's been some research where scientists have tried to clone existing species that are very much in danger of going extinct. So instead of just allowing them to breed in captivity, we're trying to actually clone existing species and then reintroduce them. There has not been a completely successful use of this yet, but it is definitely something that may be used in the future. So these are all ideas for recovery. Let's talk about some ideas for protection. Forensic science, you know, forensic science is what you see on CSI on TV, but forensic science is actually being used to test questionable materials to see if they're coming from endangered species. It's being used right now to test ivory. So, you know, it's illegal to trade ivory nowadays, and people try to pass off ivory saying it's not from an endangered species or it's not from an endangered area. But what they can do is actually test the DNA fragments left in the ivory, or this could be used for fur or leather as well, to see if it's actually coming from an endangered species to stop poachers. We're using for protection what are called umbrella species or flagship species. So these are kind of vocab terms. You might want to write down some information on these. The idea here is that if we can protect one species and get people really involved in protecting one species, that we can end up actually protecting a lot of others as well. An example of an umbrella species are these tigers we've been talking about. When you protect these large mammals, umbrella species, write this down, are usually large mammals. When you protect a large mammal, you're not just protecting the mammal, you're protecting its entire habitat. And so when we protect the tiger, we're protecting the tiger and all the plants in the area and all the other smaller animals in the area, the tiger's prey. So there are a lot of other species that are impacted in a positive way. So we call that tiger an umbrella species. A flagship species is a little different. A flagship species is something where that an organization uses to kind of get people to jump on board to protect and get into this idea of conservation. An example of a flagship species that you all know, write it down, you'll remember it, is the panda. I am sure you've all seen the WWF, the World Wildlife Federation or World Wildlife Fund symbol of a panda before. So the idea here is getting people to jump on board to save the panda, but then that organization can take all the money and use it to protect many species. Okay. Governments are getting involved with just literally protecting areas for organisms to live. Right now, about 12% of the world's land is in protected parks or protected areas. This is most important to do in biodiversity hotspots, areas where there's high numbers of endemic species. And remember, endemic species only live in one area. We learned that word in an earlier chapter. So if there's lots of organisms that only live in one place, it's really important that we protect them so that they are not at risk from becoming extinct. There are some economic strategies for recovery here. Two main things. One is called debt for nature swap. One is called a conservation concession. Both very simple ideas. Let me explain them to you so you can write them down. Debt for nature swap is the idea that developing nations and developed nations can work together to save biodiversity. So what happens is a developed nation like the United States goes into a developing nation, gives them money to pay off some of their debts, and in return the developing nation promises to not destroy or hurt some natural areas. So it's a swap here. We will give you money if you promise not to degrade your land or not to cut down your forests. This started in about the 1990s, most famously started in the 1998 Tropical Forest Conservation Act, where the United States went in and did this with 13 different developing nations. We will give you money if you do not destroy your lands. Similar to this is a conservation concession. What happens in a conservation concession is that the developing nation kind of initiates it more. The developing nation says, here we go. We're going to sell this forest. Anybody out there in the whole world who wants can come buy this 5 million acre forest. And what happens is conservation groups come in and buy that land so that it is preserved. They buy that land before maybe a logging company can come in and buy it. So both of these really are ways that developed nations can work with developing nations to try to preserve the biodiversity. Okay, just a few more things here on the list. Ecological restoration. If we've already destroyed it, let's try to restore it. Let's try to put it back to where it is. The most famous examples of ecological restoration are the Illinois prairies and the Florida Everglades. We are most familiar with these Illinois prairie restorations. In Lake County, you drive around and you see these signs all the time. They might not look exactly like this, but I bet you've seen signs, if you pay attention when you're driving down the road, that says, prairie restoration, do not mow. So we have gone in and taken these areas that we have destroyed, that we have urbanized, and we're trying to put them back to where they once were. And then the last thing on this list is community-based conservation. These are just local efforts to try to increase and protect biodiversity. This brings us full circle back to our tigers again, because this is what's going on in India. In India, instead of encouraging people to make a living by going out and poaching and killing these tigers, programs have started that have educated people, that have actually given people jobs to go out and protect the tigers, to buy local sustainable products, to not buy tiger meat, to not buy tiger furs. And so it's these are local small movements that are really helping to increase biodiversity.